Hello, everyone, and happy Thursday. Welcome to Something to Talk About Live. My name is Jamie Hinkle. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the Learning and Inclusion Manager at pflagnation.al. Be hanging out with you in the comments section today. And just like every week, I'm going to do what I always do, and that is bring in Jean Marie Nevada to lead today's conversation. Hi, Jean Marie.
Hey, Jamie Hinkle, how's it going?
It's going pretty good. It's going pretty good. I'm ready for the holiday break.
I was just going to ask, are you like in the mode? I feel like I am cruising towards it, although I don't feel like there's any end in sight for our work, but you know.
Totally fair. Yeah, I am in the mode officially. I watched my one Christmas movie and wrapped some gifts, and they're going to UPS this week. So I feel good about where I'm at.
Oh, someday we're going to do a whole show on our one Christmas movie, which we should all know is Love Actually, the greatest Christmas movie of all time.
Care Bears and Nutcracker Suite.
Wow. Wow. This is where we differ, Hinkle.
I will see you in a little bit.
Thanks, Hinkle. Bye. Hey, everybody. My name is Jean Marie Nevada. My pronouns are she and her, or ella if you use Spanish, and I'm the Director of Learning and Inclusion at pflagnation.al. Every single week, we get together to talk about something related to LGBTQ equality. And today we are talking about December 8th, which is in fact Pansexual and Panromantic Pride Day. So there is a lot of misunderstanding around what pansexuality actually is, when it's appropriate to use the term, and how it relates to other sexual orientations that we often talk about, and also how its definition has evolved and changed over time. And so to have this conversation, we have two really interesting guests, and I have a feeling we're going to have a very, very animated conversation. I would like to introduce Kendall Jackson, who's coming to us from Tilburg University, and my colleague at pflagnation.al, Mackenzie Hart. Hey, Kendall. Hey, Mackenzie. How's it going?
Great. How are you? How are you, Kendall?
I'm great. How are you guys doing? Thanks for having me.
We are so excited to have you here. And we appreciate you actually doing this from not at all close to us right now, geographically. So thank you for making the time for us. So I would love to talk about, first of all, what brings you into this conversation and how you got here, besides we beg and plead and ask you to please do our show. So Kendall, what brings you into this? So what is a little bit about your advocacy and academic background that relates to this?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really, really excited to be here as well. So my background and my academic work is primarily in immigration law and specializing in Europe, but I've worked in a variety of fields from social work to international law. And the focus of my master's research was on gender identity and how assumptions of social notions of gender underlie asylum law decisions that are made in Europe and in the United Kingdom. And also, I don't want to go too in depth into this because I know it's not interesting for everyone, but I also did some research in my master's on identifying a gay threshold, which was my own term that I came up with, which basically looked at how does someone have to act? What do they have to look like? What are their mannerisms expected to be in order to be worthy of protection under asylum law in Europe? So obviously, that's a very tricky question, especially because of how preconceived notions of queerness shape law. So that's primarily what I've focused my studies on. And I'm here and I'm super excited because I also identify as pansexual. So I'm really, really excited to be on this chat today with Mackenzie.
Thank you. And honestly, that actually sounds like a whole other conversation that I would be really interested to have, because that raises a bunch of different things and obviously some super light reading for everybody to do. Mackenzie, talk about what contextually brings you into this conversation.
So I identify as bisexual. I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but I've been interested in LGBTQ plus work since I was in, I believe, 4th grade in Massachusetts when same-sex marriage was legalized. And I remember thinking, wait, that wasn't legal before. It had never crossed my mind that couldn't have happened. So that's kind of the beginning of my interest, and then has carried me here to PFLAG, where I get to work with Jean Marie every day and Jamie every day and get to do a lot of education work and have really meaningful conversations like the one we're going to be having today. So very excited to get to have the opportunity to have this chat.
Thank you. So you both went to Fordham University at Lincoln Center. You traveled in some of the same friend groups. You took a lot of the same classes, and you've even shared roommates. So have you met before today?
No, I don't know
Oh,
who this person is. Kendall, I thought that your name was like Jane Ann or something. I don't know.
you were close. You were close with Jane Ann, but not quite. Not quite. Yeah, I think we passed in the hall like once or twice, but my memory's not the best.
Well, we're going to work with that potential connection that you're both denying, and get into the conversation. So, this week we're focused on learning and talking about pansexual identities. But that conversation gets really big really quickly, in my own opinion and in my own sort of experiences. Maybe we could start with you, Kendall. So you did mention that you identify as pan. And could you talk about how you define that to other people?
Sure. Yeah. So I identify as genderqueer and pansexual. And personally, for how I describe my pansexuality, is that I can be attracted to anyone, any gender identity, any sexual orientation, and it's not really limited by socially constructed barriers or notions. I'm attracted to other people based off their personalities or their physicality, but it's not limited just to their gender identity or limited to a gender identity.
To a single one. Thank you. Or
Correct.
a binary
Yes.
one either. Mackenzie, now this is where it's going to get fun. Please define for us, talk about how you explain your bisexual identity so we can sort of get into where this similarity, overlap, and also some of that contrast might exist in these conversations.
Absolutely. So the way that I describe myself is that I can be attracted to people of genders unlike and genders like my own. And I have not found a limit to that, I think there's a chance I could be attracted to all genders. I don't know. I don't want to say that outright because you never know. There might be a gender identity someday that someone aligns with that I personally don't. But at this point, that's kind of how I describe my own bisexuality. And one of the reasons why I use that word instead of other words that fall under the bisexual plus umbrella, which can describe anyone who can be attracted to more than one gender, is because of the history of the bisexual movement within the LGBTQ plus movement, and because of some of our bi elders and bi ancestors who have fought and honor that word. And so that's specifically why I personally use that word. But again, my definition is that I can be attracted to people of genders like and unlike my own.
Thank you. So, for people who are listening, some of that might sound fairly similar, but you were very intentional about how you talked about this, and the words were absolutely not the same. I mean, even in sort of how the frame was put around it. So maybe we could start with you, Mackenzie, and talk about, could you talk a little bit about, in your opinion, and Kendall, I totally want to hear your take on this one too. I'm definitely hoping we're about to set something on fire and create some interesting discussion here. But Mackenzie, can you start by talking about how these two definitions to you, again, because this is very contextual, differ? So where is the contrast, and why to you, again, in your opinion, might somebody use one of these over the other?
I think that this is not going to be a satisfying answer to many people, but people very well intentioned want to find this one exact objective difference that is going to apply to every single person. And they want to do that in order to respect people's identities. So it's ultimately from a good place. But I think that what gets missed in conversations like this, or when people are asking that question of saying, what's the difference? What is the exact difference that's going to apply to every bi person and every pan person? Is that at the end of the day, there actually isn't one clear objective difference. People are going to have their own reasons for using each of these words or any other words, and they're going to have their own definitions. And the best thing that allies can do is to respect the individual person and listen to what individual people are saying to describe themselves. And I'm not going to lie and say that that's extremely easy. It can be hard, especially if you know multiple people using the same word and they're all using different definitions, but that is the most important thing to do. And so while I absolutely personally understand the drive to find that one clear difference and say, well, bi is this and pan is this, that's just ultimately not going to ever happen, because there's always going to be people using either of these words or any of these words in their own unique way. And that's the approach that I take when trying to have the conversation.
Kendall, respond to that for me, please.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything that Mackenzie has said, actually, because I think it's true. People can use one term or the other, or both. I think I'm at a place now where I'm comfortable with either term being used, where I wasn't always like that. Well, either term being used to describe my own personal sexuality, but not everyone will feel comfortable with that. And so I think, yeah, what Mackenzie just discussed is super important. And I would just back that up, actually, which is to respect how other people identify, and kind of keep an open mind about how other people define things and what resonates the most with them regarding their sexuality.
I think.
Yeah, I mean, oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, please continue. Sorry.
Oh, no, I was just gonna say, yeah, my understanding of bisexuality has really, like, changed over time. Like, I think initially I thought of bisexuality as very gender exclusive, bi meaning two, and, like, in my mind, it was so simple as, like, bi means two, pan means all, okay, then we go with this one, which it's not like that, and, like, the way Mackenzie described it, it's not just two genders, it's not always within the gender binary. Bisexuality rarely refers to that, actually. So I think Mackenzie and I've had a lot of meaningful discussions, that helped me grow in how I understood bisexuality, to the point where I feel more comfortable with it being used to describe myself.
And actually, that was one of the things that I wanted to ask both of you. You both are at this moment embracing different terms. And yet, Kendall, you just said, I'm actually kind of comfortable at this point if somebody were to use one term over the other, but that was not always necessarily the case. And maybe, Kendall, you can start talking about that a little bit more. Were there any particular things that sort of moved you to get to that place that really shifted your perspective? Was it talking to people? Was it learning more about the history? Was it a combination of things? I'd just be really interested, because I find that when I am, especially when we're doing teaching, people get really stuck on this point. And I'm always fascinated when I hear from people inside of these communities who are like, here's how I got here. So what was it that sort of inspired your journey on, or your evolution? Not to say that it needed to evolve from one to the other, but this change that's happened over time.
Yeah, I mean, I think, growing up especially, I think the way bisexuality was depicted, especially in media sources, is only as being attracted to men and women. And I think I also grew up in a very small town where, like, there wasn't a lot of access to resources around sexuality. So when I thought of bisexuality, that's what I thought of, was it's only men and women. It doesn't include anyone in between or outside of that or beyond the gender binary. And so I think initially for me, that term felt wrong, because I was like, there's no way I'm only attracted to people who define themselves as men and women. But yeah, I think a lot of that had to do with media and news representations, perhaps, of bisexuality, and how it was very limited in scope. I mean, 10 plus years ago. Now I'm aging myself. But I think I think like what you were asking about that journey, I think it's been opening up and talking to people more, trying to keep an open mind. I mean, when Mackenzie and I first met, no, almost 9 years ago, I was very staunchly, owning the pansexuality label. I still very much do. But I think through conversations with Mackenzie, through unpacking and, like, unpicking my own ideas about bisexuality, and with keeping an open mind about how those terms are actually defined, I've really been able to kind of grow to a place of comfort with it. And also realizing that there was a lot of perhaps misinformation or misrepresentation of these identities. I mean, there still is, of course, but especially 10 plus years ago, when I think I was kind of coming to terms with it a little bit more, there was a lot more misinformation or narrow-mindedness around what bisexuality looked like.
I as you were speaking, I had this moment where I'm like, oh, me too. Because I think that part of even my own evolution on this one was that what I had seen, what I had read, what I was exposed to largely was a very binary view of bisexuality. And it was only talking to Mackenzie, talking to some other people who I got to know, that actually expanded that. But I think that is probably a pretty big experience that a lot of people have had. And I really appreciate you sort of saying that. So Mackenzie, as someone who identifies as bi plus, what pushed you to embrace that particular term over perhaps pansexuality, knowing that you and Kendall are in the same generation, sort of in the same age group, functioning in the same circles, and yet you landed in very different places?
Absolutely. I actually did use the word pansexual to describe myself for a period of time, and the reason that I stopped doing that, one, was because I actually didn't have the understanding of gender identity that I did now. So it was very surface level readings on what gender identity and what transness meant, and I didn't know the phrase non-binary. And so part of it was having the realization that I was saying I'm pansexual because I could be attracted to someone who's trans. And I realized that for binary trans people, that's actually a pretty problematic way of discussing that. My understanding of all of these things has very much evolved since that point, but that was one thing that jumped in. And then another, probably the main reason why I stopped identifying as using the word pansexual outwardly and moving towards using bi was because I was finding that a lot of the information that I personally was receiving about the word pansexual was more reactionary and kind of biphobic and very bi-erasive, where I meant, earlier I mentioned the decades and decades and decades, and I mean centuries and millennia of bi people, but of bi people in LGBTQ plus movements that were kind of being erased the way that definitions were being used, saying, oh, bi only means men and women. It's not trans and non-binary inclusive, but pansexuality is, so you should be using that. I realized that that's the messaging I was receiving, which was erasing several bi trans people over the course of history, as well as the Bisexual Manifesto in 1990, which explicitly says that bisexuality is not binary. And so for me, it very much was a personal way of fitting into that history and saying, wait, hold on, this is something that that I want to align myself with, and I don't want to be identifying in a reactionary way, which is what it would have been for me personally. Coming to use that term in a different way, in a more authentic way, is very different than the way that I was using it and the way that I was taught to use it. And so that was kind of me saying, hold on, and kind of undoing and unlearning a lot of that. Though, much like Kendall, I don't mind if someone were to describe me as pansexual when they talk to me. However, I would never lead with that. So that's kind of my own personal journey with that, with those particular words.
One of the reasons I'm especially enjoying this conversation is I think both of you are actively acknowledging through your own stories, I think how tough it is, even as people inside of the queer community, to sometimes even get access to information, to even get access to people's stories, to even get access to a broader spectrum of conversations around this. And I think that just because we're in the community doesn't mean it's obvious, doesn't mean it's clear. And I think it really reflects on how much work we have to do inside of our own spaces. So because we've only done this show 120 plus times, and I'm just getting used to it, I totally neglected at the top of the show to mention the article that we shared with people this week, which actually was from the BBC. It was Jessica Klein's article, which is Why Pansexuality is So Often Misunderstood. And if anyone who's watching wants to read it, it's a really fascinating read with some interesting personal narratives. We do have that available at straightforequality.org/discussion series. But one of the interesting things in the article was that the article actually goes through a lot of the history of pansexuality, in common movement, in current movements, and how we're talking about it. But it also spends a lot of time on the language that people who are pansexual identify use to discuss themselves and their attraction. And it spends actually a lot of time talking about that bisexual people do focus on gender, while pansexual people do not. And this was something that really stood out for me as I was reading. So I'd like to get a response from both of you. And maybe this is where everything goes on fire. Is that true? Is that a broad generalization? How did you feel when you read that part of the article? And I'm going to let anyone start on that one.
I mean, Jean Marie, I think things are already on fire, because we're all in this live together. So, I mean, the flames are burning. Well, I think, I definitely think it's a broad generalization, and I think, I think saying that is a very blanketed way of kind of brushing over bisexuality. And I think that was maybe some of the reasons why I initially identified as pansexual when I was quite a bit younger, was because I had that belief, which was, pansexuality doesn't think about gender. Like, people who identify with that, it doesn't matter about gender. And I think, of course, that's a generalization. Of course, you'll have people who are pansexual who think in terms of gender more so than bisexual people who identify the way Mackenzie does, as being attracted to genders like and unlike their own. So I think that works vice versa as well. So I think it's definitely a generalization. I don't think people who identify as bi are more inherently focused on gender necessarily, more or less, than pansexual people. But Mackenzie, I'll kick it on over to you as well. I think you'll have something to say about this.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with everything Kendall said, and I do think that was the part of the article that kind of bothered me, because I actually thought that this article was one of the best ones that I've read about pansexuality and bisexuality to an extent, where it dove into the history, it dove into how the word has been used over time, because I think that there has been some misconception that pansexuality is still new. It's one of the quote unquote internet orientations, but there's actually been decades and decades and decades of history of use and changes in language and everything along those lines. So having an article actually dive into that was really good. I thought the personal experiences shared in the article were great. So it really rankled with me that the author then kind of made this implication that pansexual people never pay attention to gender while bi people always do. And I have to say that that is one reason why I kind of stopped identifying as pansexual, and maybe that was a bit reactionary too, because I started feeling as though gender was not necessarily a factor, but it was not something that I ignored. And I think that that is something that has come up in gender identity as well, that the idea that we say that gender is a social construct and gender roles shouldn't exist, shouldn't be forced, but that's no one's gender should be erased, because that can be very invalidating for them. I think that that is a misconception about pansexuality and bisexuality that unfortunately this author kind of trafficked in, and that it made me unhappy, because I think that a lot of people are going to walk away from it with that wrong idea. And then in my past, I've met pansexual people who have actually used percentages to describe their attraction to genders over time. And so they say, oh, I'm 30% attracted to men, 40% attracted to women, whatever percent attracted to XYZ. Like, so it's not something that's going to apply to every single pan person, that what this article said, nor every bi person. And so it's just unfortunate that something that was a really good source of information did make that small misstep.
Yeah, I actually have to say it is a testament to how much you've taught me, Mackenzie, that I read the article and that's where I got stuck too. And I'm like, no. This was going so well until this. So I find it really interesting that you both sort of leaned into the same place. And I think that's exactly where we need to have people, that there's no one way that we can make a broad generalization on an entire community. So one of the points that really got my attention in the article that I don't think any of us actually would sort of have any disagreement on was that the number of research, pieces of research, the number of studies, the number of polls that have been done among people who are pansexual, and even this is true for people who are bisexual, there's not a lot there. There's not a lot of studies. There's not enough studies. The studies that are there don't go deep enough. They're not broad enough. They don't address enough issues that we need to see. And yet the interesting contrast here is that 2021 data, at least here in the US, demonstrated that the biggest portion of the LGBTQ community are people who are bisexual identified. So first of all, and Kendall, I'd be interested to get your take on this one. Why do you think there is actually so little research out there? And again, I mean, in comparison to, let's say, gay or lesbian identities, and what is necessary?
I mean, that's a great question, and I think it's a tough one with any type of research, especially around the LGBTQ community. But I think especially with bisexuality or pansexuality or anything, I mean, I hesitate to say beyond like the L and the G, because all LGBTQ communities are under researched. But it's very hard to get accurate studies, I think, because you don't fit into any singular category really to be studied necessarily. Sorry. I think also it's harder to gather information on bi and pansexual people, because for a lot of people as well, I mean, I think people can be in straight passing relationships, and therefore are not lumped into a category of a non-straight sexual orientation. That was probably a very confusing way of saying it, but I think it kind of, what I more mean is that there's a lot of biphobia that impacts how both bi and pansexual people are studied, meaning they're assessed based off the people they're in relationships with rather than how they identify, or they have a different trajectory to coming to terms with the sexuality that then puts them out of the access of the researchers in the way that they're looking at the question, perhaps.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's a really interesting perspective, because right away my gut went to, oh, it's because of all the bias. And I think you actually raised some legitimate other points that probably make this really difficult to look at. So there are two more things that I want to get to before we unfortunately need to wrap up, because we never have enough time, I feel like. we kind of made a lot of jokes about, is everything going to go aflame here before this is over? And part of that is because we know that there have been so many debates, so many splits between people who identify as bi and people who identify as pan, sort of over debates about how this should be approached and which one is in fact more inclusive. And yet both of you have remained friends when you have not always seen eye to eye on how you have these conversations. I'm just interested to know sort of what was at the core of that. What kept even the biggest ideological split from kind of shutting down your conversations? Because I think there's something there that's important that we should listen to.
I think it helps that Kendall and I don't know each other at all. Totally kidding. We're letting that facade crumble, I suppose. But I think the center of it is that there's a real love, a real connection, a real friendship, every other positive word there, that a real respect is a major thing, that we have had these discussions. These are issues that we do talk about kind of on our own anyway. But even when we have had disagreements, there's still that real core of respecting each other, of wanting to understand each other, and of having the goal of any disagreement not being an argument to perpetuate, but somewhere that we want to kind of land. And I will say, why I always drop things on these lives. I'm sorry. But we had a few arguments. There was one particularly rough one we had in college where we were discussing our identities, and we just weren't seeing eye to eye one day, and then we kind of revisited it the next day. But at the core of it, we realized the reason we were disagreeing was not because we were diametrically opposed, but because I wasn't necessarily respecting Kendall's language in a way that I should have been, and Kendall's language wasn't really respecting what I was using and what I was teaching other people about. And so navigating that and realizing, oh, we're still friends, we're still close, we still want to settle this, we don't want to just continue fighting with each other over this. That was the big thing. And then we both evolved and grew how we talked about identities from that conversation. So even though it was a really hard 24 hours where we weren't happy with each other, it was something that I think helped both of us grow. It helped me grow, and I know that for sure.
Kendall?
Yeah, it helped me grow for sure as well. And Jean Marie, hearing you talk about learning from Mackenzie, like I have too in all the years we've been friends, and I think what Mackenzie said is spot on. Like we both perhaps got a bit heated because we also were a lot younger than we are now. But we, at the end of the day, were able to really like come back together out of a place of love and respect for each other. And I think that was really the biggest thing, is that we approached each other with an open mind after we'd taken a breather, and then we're able to see that our friendship was way more important, and having respect for each other was way more important than being right in the fight, at least on my end. And I don't know if you guys can see it, but this was Mackenzie's amazing idea. We both have eyeshadow colored for the other flag. So I have the bisexual flag and they have the pansexual flag on their eyelids, which, I mean, it just perfectly encapsulates Mackenzie. I love our friendship and I love that idea. So we've found a really nice way of supporting one another and loving one another, even if we, like you were saying, maybe have an ideological split in how we identify.
I was actually going to suggest that it was both of you having a really incredible commitment to fabulous eye makeup that probably kept you together all these years. And on that too, Mackenzie has been spectacular in my life. Someday I'm going to have to do my green so you can see it. All right, we have a very little bit of time to go, but I want to make sure that we leave people with something to do. So I'd love to hear from both of you. One great resource that you would direct people to continue learning more about these identities. Mackenzie, you go first.
So Jean Marie, you get credit for this. I never have anything new to say when I get asked this question, but the book that we both recently read called The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, I thought was fantastic. In the book, there are multiple characters, I won't spoil anything, who have multi-gender attraction, and they don't actually have it labeled in it. And usually that actually really bothers me in media, but the way that it's written makes so much sense. And is done so well that I really enjoyed it. And it was a really good book in addition to that.
Thank you. And I agree with you. I think that lack of labels was the most fascinating thing in some respects. Kendall, you get the last word.
Yay, I'll make it a quick one. And mine's actually on the same wavelength as your guys's. But hear me out. It's a podcast called My Dad Wrote a Porno. It sounds really silly, but it's this amazing podcast with these three friends, and they talk about the porn that one of their dads wrote. And the porn is cringe and hilarious, but the characters all navigate completely without labels. and it's a podcast, like his storytelling is about pleasure and fun and embracing sexuality, and enjoying friendships, which is exactly what I think our talk has been about today. And to quote the podcast, at one point they said in the writing, the dad's writing, he says, "Labels are for gifts under the tree, never for those who are sexually free." So I think it's been something that's really like normalized. It's been something that's really normalized sexuality for a lot of queer people, and a lack of labels around sexuality. So
I
it's also
love
funny.
that. I love that it was also two very not what you expected kind of resources or things to check out. And that I think is great because it's through those stories that I think we really start to see each other. Mackenzie, Kendall, thank you so much. This was even more fun than I thought I was going to have. And I am continuing to learn. So I'm grateful to both of you. Thank you both. And hopefully we can do this again and take the conversation even further.
That would be great. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Well, that wraps us up once again as we crawl towards the end of 2022. Be with us next week. We have another great show coming up for you. You definitely want to be part of that conversation. Until then, please remember you can always get information about this program at straightforequality.org/discussion series. Do not forget about Reading with Love with PFLAG, which is, of course, pflag.org/readwithlove. And as we get into the holidays, if anybody needs support or help, please reach out to your local PFLAG chapter. You can always do that at pflag.org/find. We wrap up the exact same way every single week, reminding you to do 3 big things. And by the way, this does come from Doctor Who, if anyone was ever wondering. You really should remember to run fast, laugh hard, but most of all, be kind. We'll see you next week on Something to Talk About Live. Bye, everybody.